So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ann Stevens, who is Associate Professor of Economics and Chair of the Department of Economics, and she's going to be speaking on rising inequality in the U.S., the story of your lives. Ann.
So I'm happy to talk to you for a few minutes tonight. And I wanted to just talk about some basic underlying facts about economic inequality in the US. And when I thought about speaking to you and connecting it to the Occupy movement and what's been going on, I thought, when were these students born? So when were you guys born? 1990? 1990. Perfect. 89, all right. So in 1990, I will admit, in 1990, I was a brand new graduate student at the University of Michigan. I went there to study labor economics, to understand how wages were determined, how employment was set in the US. And at the time I started graduate school, labor economics was starting to become obsessed with one central issue. And that issue was the increase in earnings inequality that had begun in the US. And so I want to just present some basic facts about that, because I think these facts are really important, and some of them have been lost with the recent focus on the top 1%, although that's important as well. So this is a famous graph among economists, and I think the fact is becoming famous. The black line here shows from 1913 to 2008 what fraction of total income in the US is accruing to the top 1%. And you'll see the black line has a pretty notable pattern in recent years. It skyrockets. So that's a fact that we're all sort of familiar with, I think. The other two lines, you also see an increase, but they're less dramatic. Those are the fractions going to the percent between the top 1% and 5%, and then the red line between the top 10 and 5%. So this is the first clue, or the first sign here. Yeah?
Are those percents based on Americans?
This is in the US only. That's right, in the US. There's a worldwide story too that we won't get to tonight, but it's also important. So this is the first clue that there's more going on than the 1%, because you see the 1%, the increase is both recent and extremely dramatic. But some other points I want to make are that it's going beyond the 1%. The share accruing to the top 10% is increasing also. So that's one fact. The second point I want to make is that this increase in income inequality has been going on for a long time, and it's happening throughout the rest of the distribution. So when we talk about the 99%, there's diversity there too, and there's a lot of change in inequality within that 99%, and I think it's worth knowing the facts here. So what is the red line? You also see there, starting in the late 70s, you can see by 1990 there had already been a pretty big increase. The red line is the ratio of earnings for someone at the 90th percentile of the distribution, someone earning more than 90% of the country, versus someone at the median or at the 50th percentile. So that measure of inequality had already taken off. You can see by 1990 there was already a big increase. It just took economists a while to start to understand this, lags in data, getting our attention. But it's been going on since before you were born, and it's quite dramatic. The other fact here is that even at the bottom of the distribution, there's this splitting apart. Those really at the bottom, the 10th percentile, so people who earn less than 90%, that blue line shows inequality, the ratio between what they earn and the median was also going up, but then that inequality came down a bit and sort of stopped increasing. So one thing that makes talking about inequality difficult is that it's spread throughout the distribution, but different parts of the distribution changed at different times, and a lot of discussions and debate will sort of mix these things up. But the important thing to know is that there's a long trend, it's happening throughout the distribution, and you want to be kind of clear if you're going to make an argument about why something happened. Sometimes you need to be specific about what piece of inequality you're focusing on. Another really important fact, and something that's especially important, I think, to this group, is there's another way to measure inequality, which is just to look at people with different characteristics, and in particular, look at people with different levels of education and say, how much, so the bottom line that's very faint is the level of income now, average level or median level here, median, earned by those without even a high school degree. The top line is the amount earned by college graduates. So here again, what should you notice? You should notice that the light blue line and the red line are coming apart, are diverging over time. Another manifestation or description of how we've been on this long march towards increasing inequality. And so for college students, that I assume most of you are, there's a couple of really important points here. One is that, first of all, the advantage in the labor market, in the amount you earn from having a college degree, has continued to increase over your lifetimes, right? And so in some sense, economists look at this and what we call it is the return to a college education. The financial payoff to getting a college education, as opposed to this counterfactual, which is what would happen to you if you had never come to UC Davis or never gone to any college and just had a high school education. So again, this is just another way of measuring and another way of saying inequality has been rising for a long time. The timing differs, so that you'll see the return to college, the red line versus, say, the light or dark blue line, that gap kind of stopped increasing in the last decade or so. It's still spreading a little bit. And so again, at different times, different pieces of inequality were rising, but they were all rising. The last sort of fact about this description of inequality I want to point out is another way to look at inequality is to take narrow groups of people who seem to be alike. So look at all college graduates with 5 years of experience and perhaps even in the same part of the country. If you look at these groups, you also see the exact same thing. Within these similar groups, seemingly similar, the ones at the top are doing better over time, the ones at the bottom are doing worse. So the reason I present these is just to make the point that it's not just in the last 5 to 10 years that the top 1% has taken off, but something in the economy has been moving in this direction towards increasing inequality for several decades now. So the big question, which I can't cover tonight, but I'll point out what the leading explanations are, is why has this happened? The first thing I've already hinted at, which is that to know why it's happened, you have to kind of be specific about which piece of this you mean. But here are some sort of key explanations. This is in kind of economist speak, but the leading explanation is increased demand for skilled labor. All we mean by that is certain people with certain skills that can be used in the labor market are earning increasingly higher wages. It's almost it's almost circular. But why is that important? Well, if you continue to increase demand for certain highly educated or highly skilled people, maybe it's not education, maybe it's experience or something idiosyncratic. If you've had Econ 1 even, you know that that increased demand is going to drive up the price. It's going to drive up the wage for more skilled people. And one way to dampen that increase in the return is if there's also an increase in supply. What's happened in the US is that as this return to skill has increased and inequality has increased, we haven't seen a big increase in skilled labor, and we haven't seen a big increase in the supply of college graduates, and that's the last thing I'm going to talk about. Two other important institutions. One is globalization and trade. Now, economists argue about which of these two explains more of the inequality, but I would argue there's now a consensus that some pieces of this are explained by both of these, So what do I mean by globalization and trade? There are lots of ways this can happen, but one way is simply that we don't make a lot of durable goods in the US anymore. A lot of those are made in other countries where, in fact, unskilled labor or semi-skilled labor may be less expensive. Economists say that's good. There's a sense of comparative advantage if we're getting cheaper goods and our workers can do other things. But of course, you have to worry about what the wages end up being in that sector. The final explanation is what we call institutions, and the main examples of what we mean by that are decline in unionization and, in certain time periods, a reduction in the real value of the minimum wage. So economists have raging debates about which of these explanations is the most important, but the fact is they've all contributed. It's a really broad set of changes, and so it's not surprising there's more than one explanation. Okay, the last point I want to make, what do we do with all of this atmosphere of increasing inequality? What should you as college students or as young adults be doing? And now I'll remember that this doesn't skip the supply and demand curves. And that is, I just want to come back briefly to this question of why has the return to skill continued to increase? And there's a bit of a puzzle, because typically if you think the return to doing something gets really high, economists say, well, everyone should start to do that. Everyone should go to college and get a degree because you can earn more than ever now. So a puzzle is that over the same time period, why haven't we seen an explosion in the number of college graduates in the US? And here, we also know a few important facts. Economists have studied this. And I want to cite, a lot of these results come from one paper, but there are many papers out there that have tried to study this. The first fact is that college enrollments have actually risen quite substantially. What hasn't happened is that college graduation rates and college completion rates haven't risen as completely. Why is that? Well, there's a few leading explanations. One is what the researchers call diminished resources per student. So the instructional resources going in to university and college settings have declined. And here I want to be a little more precise, because in some sense this point doesn't apply so directly to UC Davis students. Because mostly what's happened here is there's also been an increase in inequality in sort of the level of resources going to different students at different colleges. And so what research shows is that it's particularly students at lower tier public universities, two-year colleges, not junior colleges, but not state universities, but other colleges where the budgets have become even tighter than we've experienced at UC Davis. Those are the students who really have seen resources shrink. Second fact is that many more students now, given trends in income, given trends in earnings of families, have increased their work hours. That makes college take longer to complete. And the final point that really is relevant to what's been going on at Davis also is that we see rising college costs given family income, and that makes it more difficult to go from enrolling in college to complete it. The bottom line here is that college enrollment's increased, but time to degree has increased, and there's been no increase over the last couple of decades in the number of college graduates. And that's where you find yourselves. That's sort of a very brief tour of the economic setting, and that's where I'll conclude for now.
Thank you very much, Anne. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Eric Rauchway from the History Department, who's going to speak on protests and politics.
Thank you. I wouldn't presume to say that my 10 minutes tonight are going to be given over to telling you that things are bigger than you think. In fact, I'm going to try to make them seem as small as possible and talk to you about this story simply as a tale of two charts. This is chart number 1. This shows average annual tuition and fees for the University of California from the period 1975 to roughly the present. I think it only actually goes up to 2010. These are inflation-adjusted dollars. Okay, so back there in 1975, you're just around $2,200 a year in inflation-adjusted dollars to come to the UC. There's a largely flat, slightly rising period up here in 1990, 1991. Then there's a big spike right here. There is a flat, even sloping downward period here up to 2001 or so, and then things really begin to take off, and this, of course, is within your and my memory. So what happened here? Recession in the 1990s, recession in the early 2000s. Let's stick it to the UC. Why should we stick it to the UC? Well, everybody else has a bigger lobby. Prison guards got a union, nurses got a union, high school teachers got a union. UC students don't have a union. Somebody's got to speak, and nobody's speaking for the UC. Here's graph number 2. This shows unemployment rate by age group over the last 10 years or so. And I thought it would be worthwhile showing both under 25s and over 25s, to show that, first of all, in normal circumstances or anyway, there's a gap there between the under 25s and the over 25s. But what happens here in the recent economic unpleasantness, or the Great Recession, or whatever you want to call it, is the width of that gap increases. Right? So if the gap over here is maybe on the order of 5 or 6%, over here it's on the order of 8 or 10%. Right? So the unemployment problem in the current era is hitting harder people under 25 than it is people over 25. So guess what? Things are worse for you than they are for us. The old people are sticking it to you because we can. What makes this kind of thing not happen? Right, there's sort of, the title I gave David Beale for this talk would be Protests in Politics. And the question is, can we make a generalization about American history in which we can say, when is it that protests influence political leaders? Because we know that there are times when they do, and we know that there are times when they don't. We can look at sort of two major periods in America. I'm using American history because, of course, we're talking about the American context, and the American institutions here are roughly similar over time, but also because America is, largely speaking, a country without revolutions. Right? You want to fix something, you're not going to overthrow the man. You're going to have to persuade the man. That's sort of the way things work. And in American history, there are many examples of this. Let me talk about two periods where you can see sort of stark contrasts between protesters and politicians. And there's really a tale here now of two depressions. There are two periods in American history that we talk about as depressions. There's no technical definition of a depression, right? If you go to the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research webpage, it says a depression is a really bad recession. That's the social scientific definition of a depression. There are two periods that we talk about depressions. There's the 1890s and the 1930s. So there's the depression of the 1890s that we talk about. This is a period with very high unemployment. We don't really know how high because data keeping wasn't as good then as it later became. But it's very high. It's probably at its peak on the order of 20% or so, something like that. A period of very high unemployment. A period of very considerable protest in the United States. Right? This is the era of the populist movement. This is the era when the populist movement, in fact, takes over the Democratic Party. When William Jennings Bryan is nominated in 1896, right, stands before the convention, tells them, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," right, and throws out his arms and puts on his head, and everyone thinks, "Oh my God, it's our savior," right? Only he loses, like a lot. And when he runs again, he loses again. And then he runs again, he loses again. Right? The populist movement is a huge failure. Nobody pays attention to the populists, or at least not enough people pay attention to the populists. Why not? Well, there are a lot of answers to why not, but let's quickly contrast that depression with the other depression that we know more about. Right? In the 1930s, the Democratic Party is once again a party that's being forced or urged or persuaded to pay attention to poor people, and this time it's a huge success. Right? Franklin Roosevelt's Democratic Party comes into office in 1933, immediately enacts a slew of legislation to regulate the banks, to provide welfare benefits, to provide relief to the poor, right, and generally to alleviate the depression. And not only does this happen, but in 1936, Americans say, yes, we want more of that. Franklin Roosevelt wins by the largest landslide in American presidential history. Right? So what's the difference between the 1930s and the 1890s? The depression in the 1930s is worse. By a lot. And what happens in the depression in the 1930s is it's worse, so much worse, that middle-class people feel like poor people. Right? The 1890s depression is not bad enough. And for those people who are unemployed, those people can be dismissed as the mob or the foreigners, people who are lazy or otherwise vicious and not entitled to a job. Not in the 1930s. Unemployment is so bad for so long, it touches so many people, nobody is sort of untouched by the Great Depression except like John Rockefeller. He's way at the top end of the 1%. Right? So the Depression in the 1930s is bad enough that middle-class people can feel material like what it's like to be poor, and it narrows that gap. Okay. The situation we're in now, is it more like the 1890s or more like the 1930s? It's more like the 1890s, right? Not even as bad. Right? The gap, like the gap I just showed you between unemployment for the under 25s and unemployment for the over 25s, is pretty wide. So how do you get people who are not feeling the pinch to stop making you feel the pinch, because that's what's going with the first chart I showed you. You are being made to feel the pinch. We're all suffering. It's bad times. Everyone will tell you, but you are being made to feel the pinch because tuition and fees are going up. How do you make them pay attention to you? You have to show them that you are like them. And this is where another period of protest in American history comes into play, I think. We think about the period of the 1950s and the 1960s of the Civil Rights Movement. Right? You think about the Civil Rights Movement, it's an ultimate case where the two groups, the groups who are asking for relief and the groups who are being asked for relief, are seen as being different, because there's nothing more potent to describe difference in the United States than race. And yet, the African American Civil Rights Movement is able to bridge that gap by wearing ties and suits and being nonviolent and speaking reasonably and showing that they have the moral high ground. And so when you turn on the TV, what do you see? You see people who are like me being set on by German shepherds and by fire hoses. You see people who are like me being treated as if they were like them. And that's what you need. And that's what happened here, right? Because the theory was that the people on the quad were them, and they could be run off because they were them. Only they didn't act like them, right? Maybe I should say you, because some of you might be here, right? You didn't act like them. You sat, you're nonviolent, and the images that came out of it were like the images that came out of the Civil Rights Movement. People like me are being treated badly. That's not them. That's us. And that's, of course, what needs to happen. Right? What needs to happen is the nature of the protest needs to be such that they understand that you are one of them, right? That you are of them. That despite that gap, that they can't stick it to you. One more thing with that chart, if I can bring it back. All you want is the same opportunity they had, right? All you want is the same opportunity they had. That's not so much to ask. You don't want unicorns and ponies, right? You just want the UC at the same price that they got. That's not so much to ask. And the more you show them that you were just asking for what they had, the more successful I think this will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Now I'd like to introduce Michael McQuarrie from the sociology department.
You have to take the microphone.
You have to take the microphone. Yes.
Thank you. This is being recorded for Homeland Security.
Raise your hand if you can't hear me speaking at this level. All right, that's terrific. My name is Michael McQuarrie. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at UC Davis. And what I'm going to talk about today is related to both some of my sociological research, but also to some of my experience before I became an academic. Before I went to graduate school, I worked as a labor organizer in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky, organizing healthcare workers. And then I went to work as a community organizer in the South Bronx, working for an organization that was operating in the tradition of Saul Alinsky. In working in those settings, I became very frustrated. And the main reason that I became frustrated was because I felt that the methods and tools, the tactics, and the critiques of labor unions and community organizations were no longer up to the task of dealing with the modes of authority that the elites and institutions they were challenging were using to marginalize them. I want to explain a little bit about what I mean. But before I do, I want to set up a thesis. The thesis is, since the 1960s, our society has become much more participatory. A mode of democratization has taken place in which citizens have the right to speak in any number of forums, organizations, and institutions. This is not how we normally think about our society. We think about it as more unequal, and we think about it as less democratic. And yet, what's actually happened is the critique of the 1960s, that our society was not communal enough, that our society was not participatory enough, and that our society did not allow for enough individual expression was incorporated. The 60s movements won. What do I mean? Recall in the 1960s, for example, in urban government, a city like Chicago was run by a clientelist boss named Richard Daley. He excluded everybody's voice from the running of the city other than his clients. He was criticized by community organizations like the Industrial Areas Foundation, Alinsky's organization, various civil rights organizations, and so on like that. Such that today in Chicago, most government agencies in Chicago are required to allow citizens to speak on the functioning of those organizations and institutions. So the police have a real citizen review board, which many cities do not. Public education is built on any number of participatory fora and invites the decision-making of the citizens of the city in how the schools will be run. What's happened is that the authority of our institutions and organizations has been reconstituted to deal with the critique of the 1960s. Saying that organizations are no longer participatory is no longer enough when you want to critique these institutions. And I just want to pose a contrast for you, one that we're probably all very familiar with. We've had lots of participation on campus over the last 2 weeks. We've been invited to participate in any number of venues. We've been invited to come and say our piece in any number of places. And a number of us have gone to these events, right? How many of you were at the General Assembly last Monday? Yeah, me too. It was pretty cool, right? I thought so. How many of you went to the town hall? Not as many. Why don't you go? How many of you at least saw the town hall, the live feed? Yeah, okay. Were they the same kind of participation? Was the same sort of consensus building happening? Was your voice invited and taken seriously in the same way? I would argue no. But to say that the administration ignores your voice also is not up to the task of dealing with the way the administration tries to deal with the problems of the university today. All right. This has happened in a number of ways. Institutional authority has been reconstituted around the values of the 1960s. A couple of sociologists, French sociologists, actually studied a transformation in the way corporate managers are trained. It used to be that when you became a corporate manager, you filled a role, and you were situated in a hierarchy of authority. And that's one of the things that the 60s movements criticized. They criticized hierarchy. They criticized bureaucracy. They criticized the routinization of social relations, and so on. Over the last 40 years, corporate managers have been trained to do entirely different things. One, they've been trained to figure out how to constitute corporations in a much less hierarchical manner. They've been trained to enable workers to express their individuality on the job in all kinds of ways. They've been learning how to deal with multicultural workers that come from lots of different sorts of communities, have lots of different experiences, and use that diversity to create knowledge for the corporation itself. Right? It's just one example. Government agencies are basically all required now to have citizen review before they can enact changes in bureaucratic rules. More ominously, perhaps, there's now a huge industry in this country of companies, both nonprofit and for-profit, that sell participation services. These are often staffed by ex-60s radicals who really believe in the transformative power of deliberation and participation. They sell their services to philanthropies, local governments, bureaucratic agencies, and corporations. I was shocked once. I asked my father to go to a town hall, which was for about 20,000 people in Cleveland, Ohio. He lives in Cleveland, so I was asking him to go for me. I was being a lazy researcher. And he went, and he came back, and he got on the phone. He said, oh, yeah, I've done this exact kind of thing before. I did it in the Marine Corps. He's a colonel in the Marine Corps. The military uses participation services when they're figuring out how to do logistical strategies for deploying troops to the Middle East. All right? Now, if the military is using these participation services, I think that it's safe to say that this forum has spread throughout the institutional landscape. Participation is everywhere now. Another development that's indicative of this transformation is the rise of grassroots lobbying firms. Grassroots lobbying firms are specialized firms that are contracted with by the same lineup of actors, corporations, government agencies, local governments, philanthropies, and so on, that basically sell protests. What they will do is they will enable companies, for example, if you're Walmart, for example, and everybody thinks you're an evil corporation, there's a consensus of public opinion out there that wants to start reining in your power to transform local communities. Well, the grassroots lobbying firms will enable you to produce your own citizen voices. So if you go to the Walmart corporate webpage now, there's a whole section there that's designed for people who support Walmart and want Walmart to be able to do what it wants to do. And Walmart is able to demonstrate to government officials that want to regulate them, for example, that they have just as many citizens as the people that are criticizing them, marginalizing and relativizing the people that want to rein in their power. Again, protests, participation, these things have proliferated everywhere across the landscape. In the process, politics has moved indoors. Elites are now willing to meet people around tables. There's not that much reason to take to the streets. And so street protests became highly routinized in the era after the 1970s. There wasn't that much of a problem policing it. There wasn't that much of a problem doing press releases that deal with the critique that's offered by protesters. And protest increasingly also just simply became ignored. At the same time, there was lots of politics happening indoors. There was lots of politics, for example, around negotiating tables between unions and companies. That's an indoor form of politics that's very important, as the first speaker demonstrated. Right? That has a lot to do with whether or not we become a more equal or less equal country socioeconomically. That was mostly an indoor form of politics. Community organizing groups went indoors as well, as they were welcomed into the halls of government and also into philanthropic offices in terms of their input was invited in figuring out sort of what sort of interventions should be planned for the city. At the same time as this happens, a battle ensues over what participation is ultimately going to mean. Participation in the town hall meeting last week is not the same thing as the participation that took place on the quad last week. These are different modes. And what's happening is, and what has happened over the last 30 years, is you've seen a series of battles over which mode of participation, for example, or which mode of community, or which mode of individual expression will be the most authoritative, which one will carry the most weight. I would argue that on UC Davis's campus, that battle's not been happening. The administration's basically had a monopoly in terms of defining what form of participation was going to be authoritative until the Occupy protesters went out on the quad. All right. So you've seen this competition. In the course of this competition, elites have been refining their technologies of participation in ways to ensure that allowing citizens to have a voice will not necessarily allow them to have authority, will not enable them to make decisions that matter for these institutions and these organizations. Right, okay. The University of California, I would argue, is absolutely an institution that's incorporated these practices of authority. They've increasingly used practices of participation, the invocation of community to constitute its authority. Think of how many times Katehi over the last couple of weeks has used community, the campus community, both to delegitimize protesters and to defer efforts to hold her accountable for the actions of police. This has happened several times. So why does occupation matter for the universities? It matters because these practices of authority, the ones that rely upon modes of participation and the invocation of community without necessarily deferring authority or responsibility to actors other than the administration, they need to be challenged. The occupation on the quad and the general assemblies that go with it operate as a standing challenge to the administration's authority. Not because it pretends to be a dual power, which is what Marxists used to call this kind of thing. I don't really actually think that the people on the quad seek power over the university. But because it constitutes a creative tension with the modes of authority the university depends upon as it carries out the transformation that many of us are unhappy with. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. So if I could invite the three speakers to comment. We only have 2 chairs, so. So we're going to take about 10 minutes for questions that you'd like to raise for the speakers.
Dude, could you pull the table back a little bit so that I can see that speaker?
And so when you answer the question, please use the mic. And we'll be trying to pick up the questions here with the mic from the camera. Yes, please.
This one's for the econ professor. So, in relation to your speech and the history department speech, looking at the level of inequality, I see that it's increasing, and then looking at the level of our tuition increases is also increasing at an exponential rate. And so I'm wondering have you looked at the growth rates of wages in terms of the top 1%? And is that growing more so than the 99%? So basically our wages, like what is the growth rate of our wages?
So the basic fact that, so she's asking how if this is correct, how the growth rate of wages of the top 1% compares, I think, to the rise in tuition.
Or in terms of the 99%,
In terms of the 99%,
are our
right.
wages growing at the same rate that the top 1% is growing at?
Right, so are the wages of the top 1% and the 99% growing at the same rate? The answer is absolutely not. So I sort of had to go through that quickly, but the best way to see it was, if you remember the second graph, there was a line trending up, and that was actually the weekly wage of the 90th percentile, so not quite the top 1%, the top 10%, relative to the weekly wage, I think it was of the 50th percentile, the median. And the fact that that was going up says that the wages, the weekly earnings of those at the 90th percentile were increasing faster over a long time period than the wages at the median. And any way you cut it, that's true. Wage growth has been faster at the top than at the bottom.
Are there any theories proposed as to why this is happening?
Lots. We're economists, so yeah, we've got, so there were 3 I put up there. One is something about technology, that the products we're demanding now are to make those products and services require more skilled workers, where skill is really a catch-all for anything. It's education, it's idiosyncratic ability to produce any good or service. And so that's not very satisfying because it's kind of a black box, but that's sort of one of the explanations. The other is globalization and trade. Some goods are now being produced in other countries, and so skill groups that used to make cars or other durable goods don't have the same employment opportunities as they used to. And then there are the institutional things, decline of labor unions, erosion of the minimum wage, and those sorts of explanations.
Yes, up there.
My question is also for you. So there was a sort of political piece of your argument having to do with unions and minimum wage and stuff. But I also was wondering about Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson's book, which makes sort of a political argument related to, and especially this is about the 0.1%, not the 1%, related to sort of financial deregulation, tax policy, and especially the treatment of hedge fund profits, and also the failure to regulate corporate pay, things like that. And I wanted to see what you thought of those arguments.
So first let me say that I have not studied, I know the book you're talking about, I haven't read it, I've seen it summarized, and I haven't really studied the explanations for what's happening in the top 1%. I will say you raised this issue of what's happened with regulation and taxes of these very high earners. And it's absolutely true. The CBO report that came out sort of shows that as income inequality, not just at the top 1%, but throughout, as that has increased, I think what most economists would agree is that, for the most part, we haven't altered policy in any way that reverses that systematically. As far as regulation, I think a point that should be made, it's absolutely true that in the US we really with some small exceptions, don't regulate earnings. We don't put caps on what people can earn, and there are, I will say, there are good economic arguments for that. There may be good economic arguments against that, but it's just a fact of the US labor market. I think the largest regulation of earnings we have in the US is the federal minimum wage, which tends to decline over time in real terms and is very controversial to raise in general. It's a characteristic of the American economy, for better or worse, that we tend not to have a lot of wage regulation. And that's true in the recent period in particular.
Take one more question. They're on.
The question is, I forgot. Yeah, I forgot your name. Sorry. My question. So I was wondering about participation, and at least if we look at conventional participation, and I refer to elections, there does not seem to be a rise in that sort of participation. And also when I think of how we racialize participation, it seems to me that those groups that tend to be more, that tend to participate more are white rather than those of from communities of color. So I was wondering how those two kind of perspectives might factor into this analysis.
So on the elections, a central component of the analysis, what I was talking about is an analysis that I'm working on with a number of collaborators on what we call the Democratizing Inequalities Project. It really is like trying to grapple with the problem of how our society has at the same time become more unequal and more democratic. We used to always associate expansions in citizenship with growing equality. And I would argue that that relationship has been broken since the 1960s. But you hit on one of the key things that has actually enabled this to happen, and that is the distribution of authority outside of the political realm. In other words, formal representative institutions have been delegitimized as decision-making bodies. And this was also, by the way, in part an outcome of the 60s critique. The 60s movements did not like formal political institutions. And they tried to constitute movements and community organizations and civic associations and so on like that outflanked formal representative institutions. Now, of course, there's another group of people that doesn't like formal representative institutions, and that is the wealthy. And what you end up with is this sort of bizarre confluence between the old leftist, the critique of the new left in the 60s and the critique of anti-government right-wingers and libertarians on the formal representative apparatus. And the combination of both of those two things is one of the reasons why you see a decline in participation in elections and also a delegitimization of formal political authority at the same time as you see an expansion of participation elsewhere. The idea now is that formal representative institutions are simply one among many places that you can express your preferences. The market is now valorized as a place where you can express your preferences, so the market is now a participatory mechanism. But so are any number of other organizations and institutions. So that's why I think you can say that this goes together, the decline in participation in elections and the increase in participation in other institutions and organizations. On race, I actually am not so sure that that's true. A lot of the effort of things like community organizations, urban philanthropies in particular, is often to actually create venues for participation for people who are relatively marginalized. And that may or may not be people of color. It could be based on class, depending on where the city is, for example. But I will assert, along with you, I think what you were trying to get at is that there are still racial dynamics that are operating here. So who's creating these fora for different kinds of people, to what purpose, and so on like that.
Okay, thanks very much. We move on to the next panel.